Right, good morning, everyone. This hearing session is now open. It forms part of the examination of the Cycle Worcestershire Development Plan Review. This is day 2 of our hearings. We are Philip Lewis and Elaine Worthington, inspectors appointed by the Secretary of State to conduct the examination and to report to the Council in due course. The format of the hearing is that it will be a structured and focused discussion led by ourselves. Before we move on with a few more opening points, we just ask the councils to just remind people about the various housekeeping issues, please, including the microphones, if you would. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning. This is a public meeting and members of the public and press are permitted to report on proceedings. Reporting includes filming, photography, making an audio recording and providing commentary on proceedings. Please note this meeting is recorded and live streamed on YouTube, and this is broadcast on the channel at SWDPR. By choosing to attend this meeting, you are deemed to have given your consent to being filmed or recorded and for any footage to be broadcast or published. If the alarm sounds, the premises must be evacuated immediately. The lift cannot be used in this instance, and please do not spend time collecting personal belongings. All emergency escape routes are clearly signed. Please make your way down the main central staircase. There is another escape route on the north side of the building if this is needed. Once you have left the building, the assembly point is in the High Street opposite the Guild Hall. Please could I remind you all to use your microphones when you are speaking. Yesterday we found it better if you've got a little distance between yourself and the microphone for sound and matters of being able to be heard. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Council, do you have any follow-on points from yesterday to raise at this point, please?
Thank you, sir. In relation to the documentation that we produced, you mean, or
anything really?
Oh, right, thank you. Yes, just to inform the examination, sir, that we have produced a distribution table to your programme officer this morning. I don't know whether that's found its way onto the website yet or not, but you've got it. That's the most important thing. And we've also provided to you the action table from the actions arising from yesterday, which hopefully you've also received.
Thank you. Participants for the matter that follows this one would have been sent a Scott schedule of some of the sites from the Housing Land Supply where representatives have raised issues with them. So with that, in order to make things easier for ourselves and to save a lot of time, we have asked the Council to set out the views of the representatives and the Council side by side. We've done that really with a view for efficiency. So everyone has that, and we'll talk to that later on. So people who are participating in the following matter haven't seen that, you will soon. But thanks to the Council for doing that. It's a bit of a task to do, but it is really helpful. Okay, just move on now just to introduce people to Ian Kemp, who's a programme officer. He's the first point of contact if any assistance is needed. I'll very briefly reprise some of the things I said yesterday about how we run the hearing. So we'll normally start a particular topic by asking for responses to questions we have before indicating we wish others to comment. As with yesterday, we're going to move on from our MIQs and focus on the areas where we have remaining questions. That is because we've had a lot of responses, very helpful responses, and it's really helped us move things on. So I really thank people for the written statements. As with always with these events, if you wish to speak, please indicate this by putting your name board on its end. Use the microphone when we call you in, and put the name board in a place where we can see it. It's surprising how a large white name board can get lost around the table. From here, happened yesterday once or twice. It does happen. It's not just us, honest. When you're speaking, by all means, please highlight certain parts of your statement and refer us to other documents, but don't repeat what's in your statements. We've already read those. We've already read the reps. We really need to move on from that. And don't make general statements, please. And first and foremost, stick to the matter being discussed. We've got a lot of things to get through in these sessions. We want them to be as efficient as possible. Okay, so before we move on to our next matter, we will start by asking the councils to introduce your team, and then we'll just go around the table of participants.
Thank you, sir. Well, good morning to you and to your fellow inspector. My name is Miss Suzanne Ormsby, King's Counsel. I represent the three authorities that are promoting this plan. And for this session, we have with us Mr. MacLeod, who is the Director of Planning at Wychhaven and Malvern Hills. We have Miss Hannah Millman, who is Planning Policy Officer at Worcester City, and Miss Isabel Roberts, who is Planning Policy Officer at Wychhaven District Council.
Thank you. Good morning, inspectors. Good morning to everybody, including those online. My name is Richard Kimblin. I'm King's Counsel. I represent both Homes England and Summits. And I'm here today with, to my left, Mr. Anthony Pollard, Director at Turley, and to my right, Mr. Mike Best.
Thank you, sir. My name is Simon Hawley. I'm from Harris Land Planning, and I'm here representing Vistry and Blore Homes.
Okay. Thank you.
Jacob Bonehill, Director of Planning RPF, acting on behalf of Barrett David Wilson and Mac Mick Group in relation to my client's interest submitted.
John Kirby, Director at Litchfields of Wayne Estates in respect to their land interests at Worcestershire Parkway.
Morning, Madam. Morning, Sir. I'm Thea Osmond-Smith, barrister instructed by John Kirby on behalf of Wayne Estates.
Morning, Rachel Damon from the Home Builders Federation. Our members represent large house builders, regional house builders, smaller house builders, self-builders, and various other people involved in house building, including housing associations. Thank you.
And Jason Tate from Planning Prospects representing Lion Court Homes.
Good morning, everybody. It's Nathan McLaughlin from McLaughlin Planning representing Terra Strategic.
Good morning, inspectors. Morning, colleagues. David Pendle, partner at Marrons, representing Ainscoe Strategic Land.
Richard Tesh, a resident of the parish of Hadser near Droitwich.
And Gerald Curl, representing CPRE, has already.
Yeah, can you turn your microphone off, please, after you use it? Thank you.
Sorry, Gerald Kells, representing CPRE, as already announced.
Thank you and welcome, everyone. Right, let's move on to our next matter. Matter 4, provision of housing. We're looking at policy SWDPR 02 and looking at the housing parts of that. We'll come back to employment on another day. Yesterday, amongst other things, we had some discussions about the spatial development strategy, and following on from that, we're looking at housing today. Matter 4 is about housing need and requirement. We'll turn to housing land supply in matter 5 before looking at the housing policies later today. So this is all about housing need and the requirement. So we'll go through broadly the questions we set out in the MRQs. Start with local housing need. So the council are proposing a housing requirement based upon local housing need as derived from the standard method, with the level of proposed housing provision being over the minimum requirement plan period. We will, during the course of the examination, consider what the level of overall housing supply would be. That's a question we'll start looking at later on, but it's a requirement we're concerned about today. The question we pose in question 30 is whether there is any justification for housing need over and above that established by the standard method. To keep this simple, we have the views of the councils on this set out in the statement, so we don't need those repeated unless you want to do that. Quite simply, they don't consider that there is a need for housing need to be higher than the outcome of the standard method. So the council have nothing to add, we will open that up. And just to remind people, we really referred to in the question what's set out in the PPG. For those who weren't here yesterday, just to confirm, we are using the version of the PPG that was prepared to sit alongside the version of the framework we're examining in the plan by, not the current version published online, because the current version of the PPG relates to a new framework, not to the one we're using. I'm sure we're all still following that. So, does anyone want to say anything? Like line call terms.
Thank you, sir. Everybody seems to be quite on this side of the table. So this is the first starting point question about is there anything to justify any increase above the standard method figure for housing? Yes. So we've made submissions in our representations about that. We obviously know that the standard method is the starting point and it's not the housing requirement necessarily. So there are ways and means that the council can choose to provide for a larger housing requirement than the actual standard method. And we'll come on, I'll hold back on the other reasons around duty to cooperate and affordable housing needs for the later questions, because we've got submissions that explain that the number should go up for those reasons as well. But certainly there's a big elephant in the room that is the new calculation of local housing need, which is significantly higher than the current local housing need that this plan is running to. Now, I do accept that obviously that we're working under the previous framework and the council have used the previous calculation of local housing need. But it has to be of some material consideration that our new understanding of local housing need under the new calculation for the standard method is that that figure is going to be substantially higher, not just marginally higher, but it's going to be substantially higher. And we've highlighted in our reps that that figure is going to increase by 856 dwellings per annum. And over this plan period, if that figure was used, it would be a figure of 17,120 dwellings over the plan period, if that figure was used as opposed to the one the council are using. So it's an increase of 856 dwellings per annum and 17,120 dwellings over the similar 20-year plan period. That's not a marginal or a minor departure. Now, at various other local plan examinations, obviously the standard method figure does change during the course of the examination process. And mainly that's due to the way that the standard method was calculated, and the affordability ratios might change slightly. And that might mean that the housing numbers go up. And I've seen various inspectors at local planning examinations ignore that because it's only fairly modest. That change might be, might be a couple of hundred or 50 dwellings per annum, or not a significant amount. Not to therefore revisit the whole premise of the housing requirement in the plan, because it wouldn't be such a significant change. But in this case, the change is very significant, and therefore I think that the council should have some regard to that, even though that's a matter that's happened post submission of the plan. And that's also in the context that an easy out for somebody to say is, well, there's going to be a review of the plan. So the government in the new framework is saying that there's a need for a effectively almost immediate review of the plan. So that'll sort it all out in the future. But if there is an opportunity to sort it out now, we are in a housing crisis, and if there is an opportunity to sort it out now through this plan, I think that that should have been a sense check call for the council to revisit the progress on this plan. Indeed, if this plan even got to 80% of the new local housing need, then there wouldn't be a need for a new early review of the plan, because the new regulations wouldn't address that. So they don't even need to go to the full new LHN, they just need to get to even 80% of it. So I think there is something there that suggests that there is a significant material consideration that says perhaps we have to have a rethink about this housing requirement of the plan. Thank you.
Thank you. As we explained yesterday, our view is that the government have been very clear when it produced the latest version of the National Planning Policy Framework by setting up the transitional arrangements in the way that they have, that we continue to examine the plan against the relevant version of the framework. And so current framework is not before us. And the government, I think, in saying that, have recognised that there is a need to get plans in place, and particularly plans that are already progressing, reached examination, should be put into place. Yeah, it may be in this area there would be an uplift in that. In other areas, it's actually a reduction. And coupled with the fact that we are under clear guidance from the ministers about not using pragmatism to prolong plans, I'm not sure that's an option that would be open to us even if we felt it was desirable, because it would effectively take the local authorities back to plan making. Plan making, in my view, should not happen during an examination. It's an examination of what's submitted, and I think the ministers are quite clear on that with the letters they've sent ourselves and local authorities. There is a new plan we'll follow closely on the heels of this one, because national policy is clear that that will have to happen. I can understand the point, but I don't think it's an approach that is actually realistically open to us in this examination. The councils have chosen to continue with this plan. They want to get the plan into place if they can. We'll continue to examine it on that basis, but I don't think it's within our remit to actually apply national policy. We did refer yesterday that there might be cases where the councils may wish to consider making some minor changes to the plan, so that there's not going to be glaring inconsistencies with some things. We talked about Greenbelt yesterday, effectively a simplification for Greenbelt policy to make sure that it wouldn't instantly be problematic for all users of the planning system. I think that's fine, and we really leave that to the authorities to tell us what they want to do on that, because we're examining the plan against the preview version framework 2 versions ago. I see the point, but it's not one I think that not a route we're really open to take. Council?
I was just to say we completely agree with you. What's put forward there is just contrary to the transitional arrangements and ignores the benefits of getting this plan in place and the delivery of over 30,000 new homes, as well as the longer term provision which we are making through this plan.
Yeah.
Just to come back, I hear what you say, sir, and I just to come back on just a couple of points. The first is, yes, we want a plan in place, but we want a sound plan, and we want a plan that is going to perform and deliver. And we'll come on to housing and supply and trajectory and all those concerns that other people have got about the trajectory in the plan later. But yes, it is get on with a plan when you've got a plan that's progressing, and that can be progressed to a plan that is sound within a reasonable time frame, but not to progress a plan that is so far from the mark in terms of its housing requirements that is almost, I think, with the differences in the numbers so significantly far away, it's almost wasting everybody's time, that we need to get on with the next one. I think also we're in a difficult position here in that the council have unfortunately already used up a significant amount of time in backfilling the evidence base supporting the plan, such that we are now at an examination that's already been very, very significantly delayed. So there isn't an opportunity, unfortunately, to take a slight breather, to take a step backwards, to take 2 steps forward, because we've already been at this examination now for, well, you've had this plan in front of you for a very, very long period of time, and the government are not entertaining or giving advice that we should be extending these examination periods. So unfortunately, yes, you don't have any remit to send the council back to take 1 step backwards, to take 2 steps forwards, unfortunately, because the council have already used that card in terms of trying to backfill the transport evidence and other evidence of this plan. So there isn't another opportunity, or there shouldn't be, in our view, any further opportunity for the council to rectify any situations. So we have to accept that that's what the plan requirement is going to be, but it's certainly a massive missed opportunity to have a re-sense check of the housing requirement in this plan, in our view.
I think it's just it's a consequence of the change in national policy. And we are where we are with this. There will be a number of transitional plans for a period of time. There will be plans submitted that would have been prepared against what is the current framework. And the government has set out provisions for, in fact, with the previous government, with the revised planning system. That's going to be coming in on track, I think, later this year. So we are where we are, but take the points.
Thank you, sir. And I suppose it would be, I should just start, by the way, by saying I agree with the comments that you've made, both before the council replied, and I agree with what they said and then what you said. It would be a strange conclusion, wouldn't it, to conclude that the plan is wide of the mark, to use the phrase, against a standard method figure from the MPPF that it's being tested against, because it isn't. And I appreciate that's a difficulty of the transitional arrangements that we've got, but nevertheless it is a fact. I've got my own views on the housing land supply, and we'll come on to that and quite where the plan is later. One of the comments that was made was about sort of 1 step forward, 2 steps back, and is it sensible to get this plan away? This afternoon, and I am jumping ahead here, and I apologise for this. This afternoon under matter 6, you'll consider SWDPR 64, of course, which starts to talk about, it doesn't talk about triggers. I think that's the point I'm going to make, but it provides a safety valve for the circumstances that Mr. Tate just referred to. I'm not here for that matter, but I suspect that under that discussion there will need to be a conversation about the immediate review that is needed to deal with the issue that Mr. Tate has referred to. He's quite right in referring to it, not in the test, as I said, but that immediate review will be something that is necessary to deal with the difference, which is material, and Mr. Tate is correct, it is material. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. I think we spoke yesterday about the transitional arrangements in the current framework, and particularly the critical date of the 1st of July next year. Now, it will be for the councils to decide whether that applies to them, the 80%, etc. But in a way, it's not really for us. But that obviously would be a consideration that frames part of what we're doing later on today. Take on what you're saying as well. Yeah, okay. Home Builders Federation.
I endorse the comments other people have made about the new system, and the housing crisis hasn't changed between the MPPF 2024 and the MPPF 2023. The housing crisis was there when this plan was prepared, and we would still highlight that as being important. So under the old regulations, we would still have been arguing that more housing is helpful to support economic growth, to deliver affordable housing, to provide a range and choice of sites. We still say there is an unmet need in the Black Country in Birmingham. It may not be quantified, but there is some. And at the moment, it dances around between all the local authorities who say, we've got an unmet need, can you do it? They say no. So nationally, there's an unmet need. And there is an opportunity, potentially, for this plan to do something to address that unmet need that just kind of evaporates because nobody wants it. And it's not quantified, so nobody has to plan for it. So as of 2023 MPPF, that still exists in the ether. So anything the plan can do to provide more sites, more choice, more flexibility, more affordable housing, deliver economic growth and support jobs would be welcomed. I think the solution may be flexibility in the policies. The solution is smaller sites, which we've commented on elsewhere. And the solution is effective monitoring. So we've made various comments about monitoring, and what matters is if the plan isn't delivering the standard methods to the minimum, when we think it should be more, there absolutely needs to be action and not just talk about action. So I think it's really just a marker in the sand that monitoring leads back to the housing numbers, and our concerns about the housing numbers could probably be mitigated through effective monitoring. But if we're not persuaded that the effective monitoring is great, then we have an even bigger problem with the standard method. But generally, more housing is better. More housing supports economic growth, whatever MPPF you're considering the plan under.
Thank you. Before I turn to the council, I think it would be fair just for us to comment that the plan before us establishes the need, but the supply the council are proposing, and we're yet to test that, is elevated above the requirement level. Now, it may not be closing the gap, but it is actually seeking to do more. So, Mr. McLeod?
And that is absolutely correct, sir. And it's 27%, I believe, above the standard method, which is obviously a significant point above that. And in response to the HBF's, I suppose, Federation's point, which we agree with, obviously, the need to increase housing supply, which is why we've proposed such significant proposals in this plan, which are not only looking to our needs during this plan period, but taking a longer-term view as well. And the best way to get delivery happening quickly is to get this plan adopted so we can get on with delivering the major proposals within it, which will take not only our needs now, but also look into the future as well. And as you've quite rightly said, we have the commitment there to move forward with a review of the plan to take account of the new numbers in due course.
Point I was going to raise a bit later on, but I'll raise it now. So in terms of where the council is at the moment, I think the housing delivery test result is above 100%. And so the longer the council goes without an updated plan in place, the supply is going to diminish, and it's really going to be replenished largely by schemes through paragraph 11 of the framework. So it won't be a plan-led approach.
That is absolutely correct. So, getting this plan in place allows us to have a plan-led approach to growth, and that will obviously bring considerable benefits to the communities which we're representing.
Okay, thank you. Okay, is there anything else on the question of whether the housing need figure should be higher than the standard method? We've got the various written submissions on that anyway. Yeah.
Sorry, sir, I appreciate I've had a couple of goes at this question, but it is quite important. The point was mentioned there about the over-provision over the housing requirements in the plan. And we mentioned that in our reps that there is an over-provision. That's welcome to a certain extent. I think that is there to try and demonstrate that the number that they're trying to achieve could be achieved, because we've slightly over-provided in terms of the actual numbers. And you mentioned that it's quite important to get the plan in place because it will be a plan-led approach. But we have highlighted that actually some 6,700 dwellings of this plan supply figure is, and nearly 25.6% of the plan requirement is actually windfall. So it's not actually identifying the locations. Your point about saying, well, we need to get this plan in place because it's going to be a plan-led approach to saying where the housing's going. Well, actually, we need to bear in mind that 25% of this plan is actually just windfall. And you don't know where they're going to go and when they're going to come forward and whether they're in line with the strategy.
Well,
but that's a general point just in terms of...
Thank you. We'll come back to the issue of windfall later on.
Yeah.
But I think Mr. Sibber said yesterday that having up-to-date settlement boundaries in place should steer the windfall, provided there's a 5-year supply, to those settlements. So if the plan is up to date and there's a 5-year supply, one would assume that development would happen as per the strategy, because that's actually baked into the plan. I think where that won't happen is if there's not a 5-year supply, and that does beg the question as to what happens after July next year. Yeah, that might indeed be the case at that point. CPRE.
So you've got comments on this. I just want to make one other point. If there is a need to deal with all this, it needs to be through proper consultation, including the people impacted by it, rather than the people who are sitting around this table. And that's why the proper way is a review, if that's the way forward, so that everybody who's affected can have the proper opportunity to comment. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that's a fair point, because whilst the plans have been quite radically changed in the past, in the old era of pragmatism, there would have been extensive consultation of main modifications I think are often put forward as, because it's during the examination, it's not a Regulation 19 consultation, so people then don't have a legal right to attend, whereas they would do if it was a plan review. Yeah, which is a point that isn't lost on us as inspectors with the consideration of fairness, because that's always a point in our minds. Because the next opportunity, next formal opportunity, really is that main mod stage. It isn't really well defined, but people would not have the opportunity necessarily to appear. I think we wouldn't deny that, but there is that fairness question that would be nagging really in those situations. Thank you. Anything from the council? Clock and planning.
Thank you, sir. Just want to make a very short point, and it's just actually picking up on what you said before the CPRE spoke. We are in a plan-led system, and I think the friction, certainly endorsing the views of my colleagues to my left and my right here, is that we know what the new framework says, and we're obviously this plan's being examined under the previous framework. But once let's work on the assumption that the plan is adopted, it becomes the development plan for decision making, and I think there's a sort of sense of concern and slight scepticism that we will be working with a plan-led system, because what the council has done, it's obviously followed the PPG, it's done the standard method as it's required to do. It hasn't made really any allowance for an increase, and we've set out our concerns in our submissions. But the point is, it's focused the delivery of the bulk of that housing requirement into some very big strategic urban extensions, which are going to hoover up housing land supply. And I don't want to tread on to the next session, but I think that's our concern. Big pot of housing, fine. We know it should be bigger, and again, it's a new standard method figure, but because that big pot of housing is effectively taken up with these large super sites, and as we discussed yesterday with SWDPR 03, the disaggregation to rural settlements is just a guide. It's not a tool for actually saying these settlements should be taking a certain level of housing. So I think it's just this point that I'm sceptical that once the plan's adopted, assuming it is adopted, we actually are working in a plan-led system. Sorry, sir.
Okay, thank you. We'll come back to the supply question later, but anything from the councils? Okay. Right. Let's move on to the next question we posed, which is about unmet need. We touched on unmet need yesterday at various times, including the legal compliance session. So the plan requirement does include an element of unmet need towards the Tewkesbury Borough Council's need. We discussed that yesterday. We know the views of the council. We have correspondence for the council and Tewkesbury Borough Council on that, with duty to cooperate, etc. Before we open it up, just really the question to the council is the plan sufficiently clear that the requirement actually includes the 500 dwellings through the duty to cooperate? It does refer to that in the policy, doesn't it? I just wonder really whether it is abundantly, whether the explanatory text goes far enough. We know because we read all the other documentation, but really an effectiveness point, I think, because it then becomes, the 500 becomes subsumed into the requirement. So need is actually increased because of need arising in Tewkesbury, because the council's plan area is very close to the edge of Tewkesbury. In fact, it abuts it, doesn't it?
That's absolutely correct. I mean, we believe it is clear enough, but we're happy, obviously, to take any. It is a point which we've discussed ourselves, actually, about whether it is explicit enough in there, because it is obviously included the 500 within our 5-year housing land supply as well. So there's an uplift to that, obviously, to meet the needs of Tewkesbury. You'll see, I mean, I won't go into the background to that, but as we discussed yesterday, there's a clear position there from Tewkesbury as to why the 500 is in there. We believe it is sufficient, but if there's additional words just to make that absolutely clear, we'd obviously be more than happy to look at that.
Okay, thank you. I think for me, it's really the reason justification. From memory, silent on it, but I've read a lot of stuff recently and it may not be.
if we propose some wording to that effect, sir, I think that we agree with the point you're making. So we'll put some wording together.
Okay, thank you. Okay, moving down to RPS.
Thank you, sir. As it is relevant to my client's sites, I think the important point is it's very clear from Tewkesbury that they need 500 houses. They have a very significant shortfall in housing land supply currently. My observation would be, I agree, it needs to be in the policy, and I'm happy to look at any modifications council suggest, but I would also clarify and note that if that need fell away, it still makes an important contribution to meeting housing needs of South Worcestershire if it's no longer required for Tewkesbury, if that makes sense. So a degree of flexibility, but yes, I agree it should be explicit in the policy what it's doing. Thank you.
Thank you. Lion Court.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Certainly on the needs of Tewkesbury, well, certainly plain reading the plan, it did seem to us that that was a provision that was there or came about to meet some unmet need in Tewkesbury, but if, I'm not quite sure where exactly it says that. But points that we've raised in our submissions about unmet needs or the needs of surrounding authorities has been about some of the other authorities that surround what is quite a large area, the South Worcestershire area. It interfaces with quite a number of other authority areas and extends quite widely in that regard. And we know that those areas are under significant difficulties themselves in terms of meeting housing needs. I don't think that's rocket science. I think that's well known and well documented. There was a statement that was made yesterday that suggested that this examination was just about being about the soundness on submission, the plan. I think it was mentioned. I think you, sir, might have mentioned that yesterday. This was about soundness on submission, which I do accept that the council should have been submitting a plan to yourselves that was sound on submission of that plan. And it's not necessary for the examination progress to backfill evidence on soundness at submission. And we'll come on to some of those things later today. But in terms of the duty to cooperate and the needs of adjoining areas, that is a fluid matter. At the point of submission, it's not those housing needs on the adjoining areas might have been X, but the duty to cooperate that's laid out in statute in the 2004 Act is one that's an ongoing duty and it continues on. I mean, and that's reflective of the council even producing statements as of Thursday and Friday last week from Bromsgrove and Redditch. So the concern that it's only about soundness on submission, I hope that doesn't mean that there are matters that could arise after the submission of this plan that can be material to the determination of the soundness of this plan. We've got fundamental problems about those duties to cooperate. We wanted to raise the necessary, we weren't allowed to attend. We think there's a legal compliance issue around that, and it might be that we make other submissions on that. But the ultimate point is that none of those statements of common ground that are supposed to reflect the duty to cooperate say anything about them having any housing needs that might need to go to this area. All it says, all those statements say, is that we don't have anything to send to you guys. There's nothing in those statements that say, what's your situation on your side? It's a two-way street. So I don't understand what those duty to cooperate statements even add to the situation. I'll give you any certainty that there's no unmet needs or there's no needs from adjoining authorities that need to be considered as part of this plan, because it's clearly self-evident that those areas have seen some substantial increases in their housing requirements and their housing needs. And some of the adjoining authorities are extremely constrained, like Bromsgrove, for example, immediately adjoining all greenbelt, whereas the South Worcestershire area has some greenbelt and some non-greenbelt. So isn't there a debate around that, etc.? So there are some real issues that are needing to be resolved in respect of that duty to cooperate that speak to the specific approach and the requirement that's set out in this plan. I think that 500 towards Tewkesbury fine, but there's no evidence to suggest there's been any meaningful or full understanding of surrounding housing needs in adjoining areas.
The point we made yesterday about the duty to cooperate is that the duty to cooperate applies from the point the plan preparation starts to the point of submission. Soundness is separate. Okay, so that's a legal duty we'll test in matter 1. When it's gone, it's gone. So that is why if an inspector finds a duty has been failed, it cannot be fixed because there's a definite date when it ends. You can fix an SA, you can fix a HRA probably, but you can't fix a duty. Okay, so that was the point about that. Soundness, we continue to look at soundness. We're looking at soundness now. Evidence has been updated. People have provided updated evidence, etc., to us at this point in time. That's what we're doing. We had a discussion yesterday about duty to cooperate. The councillors might want to come back on and just repeat some of the points about how they have spoken with neighbours. But where we've got to with this, no one has been able to come to us and say, Council X has an unmet need of Y, which should be accommodated in this plan area. So even though there was unmet need, it's not been quantified. We are not able to change this plan in a justified way because there's not the evidence. No one has provided us the evidence that adjoining authorities have said this is what the unmet need is.
And the simple point is, sir, that when you read those statements of duty to cooperate and those statements of common ground, they only say it one way. They only say, we don't have anything for you. There's no statement in those statements that say, we don't have anything for the South Worcestershire authorities. I mean, I would urge you to read them. They don't say that. They're absent of that. If they want to say that and they say, we are not going to have any needs for South Worcestershire, then fine. But those statements don't say that.
There's a very good reason, sir, why they weren't able to say that to us, because they weren't able to quantify an unmet housing needs which should be met by the South Worcestershire authorities. The only authority which was able to do that was Tewkesbury, and we've obviously actively helped them through the duty to cooperate to meet that need on the allocation admitted. I don't want to, but I think it probably is necessary for me to repeat some of the points I made yesterday around. We talked about Birmingham having gone back to the early stages. You made a point on the new standard methods. Some authorities have gone up, some authorities have gone down. Birmingham's housing numbers dropped considerably. They're part of a housing market area with 14 different authorities. Within that housing market area, we sit outside of that housing market area. There is no demonstrable shortfall from the Birmingham and Black Country housing market area, which the South Worcestershire authorities have been asked to meet.
Thank you. Home Builders Federation.
I'm just very mindful of the reality of planning in this changing world. And I know you mentioned that we can't talk about appeals and other things pending, but the reality is this plan will be used against the new Green Belt guidance, against the Grey Belt guidance, against other things. And therefore, for this plan to be helpful for planning appeal inspectors, for communities, for developers, it needs to be absolutely clear what's in and what's out. So I think we would support clarification through main modification that they've only considered Tewkesbury's needs. We would support clarification that there has been a discussion about an unmet need in Birmingham and the Black Country, but it hasn't been quantified because that just acknowledges that exists because it may come up in appeals later on and in other plans. So I think it would be helpful for this plan to be absolutely crystal clear that under the duty to cooperate, it was asked to do 500, it's done 500, but there are other issues, but they haven't been quantified, and therefore this plan hasn't addressed it, because that then leaves that discussion open for elsewhere, because it's clear what South Worcestershire have done and what they haven't done, and all we need is clarity going forward. I think that would be the most sensible way to proceed.
Thank you. Mr. McLaren.
We couldn't agree to that because obviously we don't know what that unmet housing need is. So how on earth could we be planning for an unmet housing need, which we don't even know what that requirement is coming from that housing market area? So it's completely unrealistic for us to be putting anything in our plan on that basis. And I don't think there's anything further I can say.
Okay, thank you. At this point, I think we can just start looking forward to spatial development strategies, can't we? Oh, seriously. Okay, let's just move on very quickly. We've got two boards up. So,
excuse me. Thank you, Inspector. I'm not going to repeat what I said earlier, I promise. But under SWDP R64C, the point that the HBF have just made could be referred to. C talks about review of the plan if the policy context requires a review, and that's clearly a circumstance where the policy context changes. And whilst you wouldn't quantify the unmet need, and I've got a lot of sympathy with the council, having done this myself, it's difficult politically when there is a known unmet need, but you don't know what the number is. Well, what do you do about that? And a council's not about to declare that they don't want you to do something, because politically that's not sensible. But clearly for the councils across from me, they can't write a specific figure in if there isn't one evidence. But under C of SWDP 64, it can talk about those circumstances where a plan review is triggered. And I did say I'm not here this afternoon, which is why I'm squeezing this in now. But of course, there's a link there to para 264 of the new MPPF, which will be interesting for you both, because I know you can't take that into account, but it doesn't mean you can't take into account the principle. So hopefully that's helpful. So.
Thank you. And finally on this one, CPRE.
Yes, sir, thank you. And I just would come back to H of SDP. I've got the SDP 3, isn't it, which refers to the duty to cooperate, and it says to meet the unmet development need of neighbouring local authorities where it has been clearly demonstrated to be necessary through their local plan making process, and we're content with that. There has been particular emphasis put on Birmingham and the Black Country, which is interesting because people are referring to the new MPP, the new standard methodology in terms of housing need. In terms of Birmingham, figures that I have for Birmingham went down from 7,174. This is the current year figure when I did the calculation, to 4,448. That's a drop of 2,726 dwellings per annum. In total, it's a drop of over a 20-year plan period of 54,520 homes. In effect, I mean, obviously we can't preempt where this would go, but from my knowledge of the Regulation 18, that would pretty well eliminate any shortfall in Birmingham and would probably mean that Birmingham and Black Country could meet their own need. The point I'm making is that obviously those figures are in the future and they will come through their plan making process when they get to Regulation 19. But people who are saying to you we should somehow preempt this in regards to certain places are not mentioning this huge difference, and yet are relying, and I read it in the statements, on what they, I think, are referred to established shortfalls based on the previous MPPF, which will not come into place when they go through this process of plan making. So we're content. We didn't put this in our reps because obviously we didn't think it was a problem, but it seems to have been raised as a problem. So we'd like to make clear that we don't think there is now an established shortfall in Birmingham and the Black Country, and the emphasis that is being put on it is misplaced, and you should not take note of it. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I want to move on from this point, so just briefly.
I appreciate that, but I don't accept anything that was just said there about the unmet needs. The situation is that Birmingham, yes, might have seen a reduction in its local housing need calculation. Birmingham was always a constrained authority in any event, but I think I can't think of a single exception, but just across the board, all the other authorities surrounding have all seen an increase, and not only marginal, but significantly so. And that's not surprising because the whole standard method is there to try and increase it from the around 300 figure to 300,000 a year to around 370,000. So why wouldn't it be increasing? So I don't accept what was said at the end of the table. So.
But there's no evidence as to a figure for unmet need that you can put forward that this plan should be taking, do you? You haven't got that. You haven't provided that.
No, I haven't provided that. I'd expect the council to have provided that and have spoken to and had something in these statements of common ground that says this is our situation. and how it affects you. All this plan,
The
all those
council have already
comments around
explained it.
said
We've
it's the
seen,
other way around.
they've been talking to these authorities, and the authorities it would have actually asked them, and they haven't asked them, and there's no objection from these authorities. So I don't think this point's really going to get us very much further, is there? Because even if we were to agree with you, we couldn't seek to change the plan because we do not have a justified figure we could change the plan to. Because it's not quantified, is it? Okay, let's move on then. Right, move on to question 33. The PPG includes provision to potential council to consider to increase the need figure to address issues of affordable housing. We've had the council's view on that, and their view is that they decided not to do that, but are planning to supply in excess of the requirement, which provide further contributions in any event. I will just open it up to participants. HBF?
I'm very conscious I don't want to reiterate what I've said in our statements on our matters, issues and questions responses. So all of that I've said about affordable housing and what I said previously this morning still stands. I think an update in terms of where we're at is delivering affordable housing is becoming increasingly difficult. The government's recently introduced a clearing house because affordable housing sites aren't being delivered. So it's just again focused on delivery. And again, the solution is maybe not a change to the policy. Ideally, we'd like a bigger number and we'd like more affordable housing, but that flexibility around how much affordable housing, and maybe the sites could have identification, or there's things that might happen in the course of the plan being delivered that would enable more affordable housing to be brought forward, and that requires flexibility within the policies to enable problems where they're encountered to be addressed and resolved. So the general point is we think bigger numbers, more affordable housing, and there's a particular issue around the kind of housing that can be provided on brownfield sites in some places, and whether that meets the affordable housing need. And so there's, again, just a need to marry that together and keep it under review through the monitoring framework. So if you are delivering only flats, you then go, actually, maybe we need some greenfield sites for housing, and maybe that then provides the evidence to trigger the review to look at this issue. And again, if there is an unmet need that you're meeting from Tewkesbury, what kind of affordable housing are you providing to meet Tewkesbury's affordable housing need? Is that set out? Is that clear? Because that would be relevant, again, to discussions elsewhere at local plans and discussions elsewhere at appeal. So it's just providing clarity about what the council's doing and why, and what needs they're aiming to meet and why. So we understand what needs they're not being met, that we then can talk about in other places.
Thank you. We'll come back to the issue of the Tewkesbury, the Mitten site and affordable housing when we discuss that, but bring in RPS at this point.
I was going to talk about Tewkesbury and housing because my sites are missing, etc. But just to note that in terms of the median affordability ratios, as in hearing statement, that both Malvern Hills and Wychavon are significantly above the national affordability average. So again, to echo what HBF's saying, if we, more numbers is always great for clients. That's I'm here on behalf of 2 house builders currently, but if there was a justification for uplift, it would be around affordability because the numbers are significant. There's a gap of about sort of 2 in terms of, I think the national average is around 8 now, which Avon and Malvern are around 10 currently in affordability ratios. Thank you.
I think one of the things we will do when we look at affordable housing is to look at the question about viability and to see really whether the percentages are justified that are put forward. And also the nature of sites that come forward. We'll consider through the supply as well. Line called.
Thank you, sir. Yes, we raised the issue about affordable housing and specifically how that links to the opportunity that exists to increase the housing requirements in the plan to deliver more affordable housing. So we point to that, and I would echo what was said to my left about increasing the number of houses. And the housing requirement in the plan will ultimately lead to more affordable housing being delivered. I mean, that's very much in the context that most affordable housing is delivered as a consequence of market housing. So that's where the direction of that comes. The overall housing requirement of the plan is 1293, and the affordable housing need per year is 906, as I understand from the updated assessment that the council have done, albeit we have highlighted again elsewhere that a number of the evidential documents that support this plan are now long in the tooth and somewhat dated. But the updated paper on housing, affordable housing needs suggests 906. Well, our point is that if 40%, which is the housing requirement of 1293, comes forward as affordable housing, that 40% of the 1293, which is where most of the affordable housing is going to come from, is going to get nowhere near to the 906 dwelling requirement. Obviously, if you increased it such that that 906 was 40% of the annual requirement, you're more likely to get to the annual affordable housing needs, and this plan doesn't do that. I haven't seen an assessment of an option to do that, and that would be a positive and proactive approach to delivering more affordable housing. And I think that that's important because, again, I would echo, and this, the affordability ratio is extremely poor, particularly for Malvern and for Wychavon. The final point I would mention about that is that 40% affordable housing requirement for affordable housing is a requirement of policy, but of course is subject to a viability assessment if the developments can afford it or seem to afford it. The track record here for this council is one whereby viability assessments of the largest urban extensions around Worcester, which was the fundamental backbone to the previous local plan, weren't viable to deliver affordable housing at 40%. They only delivered affordable housing at 20%, half the number, which was a fundamental failing of those strategic sites and which were a backbone to that previous local plan. Given that those urban extensions amounted to many thousands of dwellings, that loss of 20% affordable housing was thousands of affordable houses that should have been provided for through those urban extensions that weren't able to be provided because there was a fundamental misunderstanding at the plan making stage and over-optimism about the viability of delivery of those urban extensions, and they failed to deliver affordable housing. My concern, and we'll get onto it later, is that we're going to be falling into exactly the same trap. That on affordable housing delivery, there will be not enough to support the affordable housing needs. The requirement isn't high enough to support it at 40% provision. And the track record of these councils is that large-scale urban extensions or large-scale developments, in the end up not delivering the level of affordable housing that they were originally envisaged to do because the council have been too optimistic in understanding the likely provision for those sites.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's often a big dilemma in many local plan examinations. You have need expressed, the overall need, and how much of that overall need is actually affordable housing need. Still the same overall need, but it's a big really dilemma how far the market housing provided for a plan can actually go to meet that in any given area. So this has often had discussions, and certainly very sympathetic to the comments you're making. We will be looking at a number of the sites as to the viability and how much affordable housing is likely to come forward, and we'll bear your comments in mind in those sessions. Thank you. Mr. McLeod.
Yes, thank you, sir. And we certainly agree with the principles there the HBF put forward. Obviously, we need to see an increase in housing supply and affordable housing more generally moving forward across all areas in the country. So we'd certainly echo those points, but we obviously feel that this plan takes a robust approach in terms of the standard method and obviously providing on additional housing beyond the standard method. And I think just in terms of the Lion Core point, the link between affordable housing need and overall need is complex. So actually just taking the figure that was quoted, which is the 906, which is mainly based on coming from the PPG. So using that approach of looking at what's on the housing waiting list at a particular point in time. So not all of the people on the housing waiting list need a new home. Some of those are obviously in homes, and then obviously that translates, but they're still on the register. So it's not as easy as just taking that projection and just multiplying it into the future. So affordable housing provision is far more complex than that. And we feel very much the approach we've taken. It is obviously that need is part of the demographic projections which come through the standard method, and we've obviously made additional provision beyond that. So to do that and to take further provision would effectively be double counting.
Thank you. Again, we'll bear in mind your comments within the whole plethora of comments we have when we look at the relevant policies and allocations. Okay, any more contributions on this point before we move on to the next question? No? Okay. So the next question is in relation to MPPF 62. So is the plan positively prepared and assessing and reflecting in its policies the size, type and tenure of housing need for different groups in the community? Views of council on that? We have no further questions of the councils. Just really seeking for any further contributions on that point. HBO.
And developers know what's intended and how that will go in there. Basically, older person's housing needed. I think, not wanting to put words in council's mouth, the conversation will be come and have a chat with us. But again, that's helpful for communities to know that's what happened, because otherwise there's this perception that there's smoke-filled rooms, you have a discussion about viability, suddenly the older person's housing provider gets out of providing affordable housing, and that's problematic. So it's just being clear and explicit that there is a difference in this kind of product, and there is innovation, and therefore there needs to be discussion and flexibility.
Okay, thank you. Mr. McLeod?
Yeah, I mean, that's fair. But I would say the affordable housing policy builds in that flexibility. So when we get to discuss that policy, there's a clear approach there in terms of viability evidence and the approach we've taken in looking at how viability works. We built that into the policy overall.
Thank you, sir. I guess I've been listening to the conversation, and this probably strays across future agenda items as well, but clearly representing Worcestershire Parkway and Homes England, as we do, you've got the content of our matter statements. The statement of common ground that went in yesterday, paragraph 2.3, so that's exam 72, affirms that because of the nature and scale and the opportunity of development, we can comprehensively deliver a range of house types and tenures. So I think just in terms of some of the conversation that's been going preceding this, that's an important observation to make. We make a reference in our statement that we undertook a process of soft market testing over the last 12 months, which very much affirms the council's evidence as set out in its SHMAR update, that there is a need for a range of types, tenures, specific housing, to which obviously the progress of the proposed development has taken into account. You've also got references within our matter statement on this in terms of Homes England's particular viewpoints on the importance of delivering affordable housing and the priority placed on that in its own strategic objectives. In terms of the specific nature of this question, again, we would point you, as you've seen, and the council has indeed articulated in various exam documents, there is a need for lots of different types of housing. So older persons, as just referenced previously, key part of that need, not only in terms of addressing what will be a growing demand, but also in terms of freeing up other parts of the housing market. So again, we would endorse that, and through the market testing we've done, clear appetite to deliver housing on schemes, such as Worcestershire Parkway.
Okay, thank you. Mr. McLaren, any come back on that?
I don't know if there's anything for me to respond. Thank you.
Okay.
Just to come back on one point, sir, just on the statement that of common ground that literally just arrived maybe yesterday or the day before on the Parkway station or Parkway site. It's absolutely explicit at section 3 that there may be a range of houses and types and those type of things, but it says that the changes to SWDPR 18 are required to enable the level of affordable housing provision to, I presume it's only going to flex one way, I don't think it's going to go up, subject to viability constraints that may arise during the delivery of the Worcestershire Parkway allocation. I mean, that's exactly the point I'm making. I don't think you can pray-and-aid this statement of common ground as some endorsement that that site's going to deliver some policy compliant levels of affordable housing. In fact, this section is all about applying flexibility within the policy and the plan to make sure they don't have to do it, which is kind of frustrating in that the situation should be that where you test the allocations in the plan, that the default position should be that the allocations should be able to make the policy compliant affordable housing provision. Otherwise, that might have been a reason not to choose those sites. You know, if you went back, you know, in the previous local plan and said to, at the examination stage, when we were all there, some of the familiar faces that were there previously, and they said, well, actually, the urban extensions are only going to deliver 20%, that might have been a reason not to allocate them. So there should be an assumption that the allocations do meet the 40% requirement. It's the sort of windfall and others that should be engaging in the policy for viability, in my view, and not the allocations, where it should be an assumption that they will be delivering the 40%. Otherwise, that would have been a factor that should have been influencing whether or not they would have been chosen as a site. Certainly, at the time of submission of this plan, everybody was, well, I was certainly of the expectation that they'd be delivering full policy compliant levels that everybody else is having to deliver, that clearly this statement says they're not. I would like the opportunity to not.
Thank you. We'll come back to that when we look at the individual allocations. Mr. McLeod, any comment at this point?
I think it's probably better we pick it up in terms of when we get to the Worcestershire Parkway discussions.
Okay, thank you. Okay, let's move on to our final little point under this matter. It is a very minor point, really, but it's nothing else. It proves we may have looked at the plan. The policy title refers to retail requirements. We ask cryptically, is that in error? We know the answer. Thank you. Okay, that brings us to the end of the questions, the end of things we want to consider. Has everyone had the opportunity to say what they want to say in this session? So you, Mr. Tesh.
Fine. I've never been involved in town planning nor connected with house building. But I do have a history of assessing business plans and their underlying strategy. Such plans invariably start with market and volume, as does the SWDP. An experience has taught me that every forecast is wrong unless you're very lucky. And this is particularly true of the SWDPR with a specific problem. The review was published some 2.5 years ago and formulated significantly earlier. Much has changed since, and not only locally, but also nationally. But I do agree with you that unless the volumes are maintained, then the plan could become incoherent. SWDPR suggests the 3-council population increases by 30% between 2001 and 2041. comparable figure for Whithaven is actually 42%. 42% population increase over 40 years. We've traced the rate elsewhere. There is also a projected UK increase of 30% over a somewhat different time frame. The review continues the high-level 2011 to 2021 local population growth, whereas the ONS at this time was saying that the rate was going to decrease. So here we have locally an acceleration of the growth, whereas nationally it does appear to be decreasing. Now I raise the fundamental question, does a 30% population increase require 30% additional public services? And as a first cut estimate, I believe that is true. But then you can look more refined and some possibly over 30%, some less than 30%. But most of these services are not covered by the SWDPR. Hospitals, primary care, police, water, sewerage, prisons, energy, higher education, etc., etc., etc. So locally, we've got a 42% Whithaven, 42% increase in population, and yet at the moment there don't seem to be the strategic mechanisms in order to provide the local services. Whilst others are covered appear to be problematic, e.g. local infrastructure. And I've read the 2 or 3 statements of common whatever, and suggest that in many of these, the can is being kicked down the road. And that the issues, the real issues on the ground are not being addressed. So who are the people making up this increase and where do they come from? The strategic housing market assessment suggests over 75% of the increase will be people aged 65 or more. Is this realistic? I would question whether that is the statistic in your schema. I suggest it's not particularly realistic. But if so, what are the implications? The implications are that the housing mix will be substantially different, I suggest, than if it was a general population increase. Will the over 65s want to live in the new town village of Throgmorton, which appears to be isolated from services, or at the other strategic sites? Will they want to spend their retirement on a building site? I certainly wouldn't. But certainly increased demand for services in the health field. So if this 75% over 65s, then what are the implications for primary and acute care? Absolutely massive. The Sharma suggests the biggest net migration is from the West Midlands conurbation. Now, I think this continues what has been happening over many, many years. And then North Worcestershire, i.e. a continuing drift south of the population. Limited net migration beyond the neighbouring authorities. I was quite surprised how low the figure was from people elsewhere in the country, apart from the immediate localities. International net migration has limited numbers aged 65 plus. So that's not going to contribute to the figures in the schema. but predominantly under 30 are these students coming to the various education establishments around. More parochially, the population of Droitwich has quadrupled over 60 years, from 7,000 in the early 60s to approaching 30,000. But a fundamental question, are we going to have perpetual expansion? Is that a necessity or even desirable? Or is it time for consolidation and concentration on completing the existing sites? I think quite an important philosophical question. And there are sufficient sites within Droitwich to meet reasonable demand from within the existing boundary, or even this week there was 91 houses approved at Hampton Lovett on the outskirts. And where is the strategic thinking from the town and district councils about towns like Droitwich? I can't find any real strategic thinking. So what happens if and when services fail to keep up with population growth? Various scenarios, but could I suggest one? The existing population becomes disgruntled, if it's not already so. Opposition builds to each and every proposed development. Residents start to move away from locations, move away to locations where services are in balance. And those from the neighbouring authorities look and decide to stay where they are or move elsewhere. And you finish up with a surplus housing cannot be sold or let. And I would just raise the question, a build, baby, build strategy could become self-defeating in those circumstances. So that's my contribution. Quite happy to take questions.
Thank you, Mr. Tash. Mr. McLeod, do you have any response to that?
Yes, thank you, sir. So obviously our demographic requirements come from the standard method, which we're obviously built in the demographic growth and population growth within that. So that's the acknowledged method in terms of looking at our future housing needs. In terms of engagement with local utility providers, can you hear me? Oh, no? So I'll start again. So the standard method obviously takes account of demographic growth in terms of how our housing need has been calculated. And that is the acknowledged approach in terms of how we look at future housing requirements within the plan area. In terms of utility providers, we've engaged extensively with the police, the Acute Hospital Trust, Severn Trent Water, Western Power Distribution. A lot of their requirements are reflected within the infrastructure delivery plan, which sits alongside the main plan itself, looking at utility provision across the three councils. So that has been looked at in a significant amount of detail. And obviously on individual applications, we'll still have the DM approach in terms of looking at needs through Section 106 agreements, which you can secure. The strategic housing market assessment then looks at specifically at international migration. And we've included a number of policies looking at housing needs for special groups, such as the elderly, and I'd refer you to SWDPR 23, which is a policy specifically for housing for people with special needs. So we've looked at that in detail and built that into our housing requirements.
Okay, thank you. Right. I think we'll draw stumps there. Thank you to everyone for the contributions. We will adjourn now until I think 11:15, because I think Ian needs to come in and rearrange the room somewhat. So thank you very much, those that are not joining us for the next session. We'll see you later.